Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm so happy that we're all here. My name is Leah Koganelli-Melia. I am a poet and writer, founder, and director of Wordshed NYC. Just a little bit about Wordshed. We are an all-inclusive interdisciplinary community, culturally and creatively integrated, combining art forms and interlocking ideas. We welcome all artists and collaborations. And since its inception over 4 years ago, my aim for Wordshed has been to embrace artists' vulnerability, creativity, and individuality with hopes that each one of us together feels nurtured and challenged within our internal foundation. So please visit our website, www.wordshednyc.org, if you want to learn more about our event. I wanted to, of course, introduce our panelists, but before I do that, I wanted to just welcome everyone to our session. This panel will discuss a writer's identity crisis, understanding compromise in the pursuit of literary success, focusing on what challenges writers face when thinking of pursuing publishing, what benefits writers when their works are published, who they're published with, as well as the vulnerability of a writer, and what they often face when starting to research the world of publishing, what they should watch out for, be concerned with, and perhaps in some cases ignore. This panel is part of 1455 5th Annual Summer Festival. Please visit 1455litarts.org for further information about the organization and what it does and the festival with its other amazing lineup of artists, experts, writers, panels, and discussions. I would also like to first and foremost thank Sean Murphy, founder of 1455, who believes deeply in the importance of building and nurturing creative communities, showcasing work of creatives, and who supports the micro community spanning multiple artistic genres. So thank you, Sean, for giving us this opportunity to discuss this very valuable and vital topic. My panelists who are with me today are David Groff. His new book is Live in Suspense from Trio House Press. His previous book, Clay, also published by Trio House, was chosen by Michael Waters for the Louise Bogan Award. His first collection, Theory of Devolution, was selected by Mark Doty for the National Poetry Series. And he's the co-editor of Persistent Voices, Poetry by Writers Lost to AIDS, Allison and Who's Your Daddy? Gay Writers Celebrate Their Mentors and Forerunners by University of Wisconsin Press. An independent book editor, he teaches poetry and publishing in the MFA Creative Writing Program at the City College of New York. And you could visit and learn more about David at www.davidgroff.com. I also have with me Lucia Orellana. She's a bilingual writer, social researcher, and educator from Guayaquil, Ecuador. She has published 5 poetry collections and chapbooks: Extrañamiento, Valparaíso Ediciones 23, Longevity River, Plan B Press, 2019 and 2023, Sea of Rocks, Unsolicited Press 2018, Inherent, Fly on the Wall Press, Lifelines, winner of the Bitchin' Kitsch chapbook competition. Her texts and translations have appeared in Tin House, Carve Magazine, The Bitter Oleander, Poet Lore, the Santos Review, and other venues. Lucia holds an MFA in creative writing in Spanish from New York University. Welcome. So happy to have you here. And lastly, Kashif Sharma Patel is a poet, writer, and co-founding head editor of the 87 Press. Pamphlets include Relief I Willed It, Gong Farm 2021, Fragments of Mutability, Earthbound 2020, and Suburban Finesse, Sad Press 2020. He co-authored with Ashwani Sharma and Azad Ashim Sharma. And I apologize, they have a debut collection forthcoming from Broken Sleep Books in 2024. Kashif has written criticism for the Poetry Project newsletter, Los Angeles Review of Books, and more, as well as an academic essay for the Journal of British and Irish Innovative Poetics. Kashif runs a newsletter, Culture Hawker, at kashif.substack.com. So thank you, everyone, for being here and for joining. I can't wait to hear some of your ideas and thoughts about this important subject. So as we know, the publishing industry has been ever evolving, but for generations, up until quite recently, it has focused mostly on wealthy, educated, white readership, and almost solely, basically. And so the book publishing industry has shifted in many ways, like the rise of digital, self-publishing boom, significant competition from media products that have all changed the landscape of the industry. And now, of course, we even have further advanced with AI, which we'll hopefully maybe touch on later, and would love to hear your ideas about that. But the idea that anyone can publish with the press of a button, is obviously really very fascinating, but also there are such huge differences between self-publishing and traditional publishing, but also publishing with small presses. So hopefully we'll get into that. But I think recently, particularly, during after the murder of George Floyd, and the pandemic, during the pandemic, and also post and mid-Trump era, particularly in the US, I'm talking about the protests, the book publishing was kind of under a lot of scrutiny, aside from all the other industries, I would say. It's just not in that. But because we're talking about that, particularly about narratives of, huge array of people and cultures. So, a lot of the history and groups of people have been ignored and underrepresented in this industry. And so Black editors and writers, particularly in the US, but which I think also in general just kind of speaks about the issues that have plagued this industry, because in a sense that shapes also the stories and the narratives that we kind of, throw out there and then have our readers adapt to and kind of internalize, which, I feel like is limiting the overall audience. And so our vision to see the outside world and what we know is just only what's familiar to us. And so I think that now the publishing industry has becoming more open to hearing and accepting other stories, other narratives of people and cultures. I think that hopefully even our textbooks will look a little bit different in the coming future. But I just wanted to throw my first question out there in terms of what you feel about, what I've just kind of mentioned, and also what are some of the things that you believe editors and publishers are looking for at this point in the game. And I just want to mention, if you could just, before you start answering the question, if you could just briefly let us know what your role in the industry is. So, Kashif, would you like to start?
Sure. So, I guess I'm a writer and a publisher, so I see it from both perspectives. And I was a writer before I was a publisher, and myself and Azad Ashim Sharma, we were loosely part of a poetry scene, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
But we understood that there was really a limit to the kind of poetry we were and the kind of writing that we were producing and some of our peers were producing in terms of where they could go to get published. And we felt there was quite a big deal. This was in England, in London, and in Brighton, a small town on the coast. And there was quite a big DIY scene, a very big DIY scene with small presses, but nothing in between, nothing where you could go, to something more formal, that could give you a bit more stability and that could give you a wider reach. So that's what we noticed, and obviously a lot of that was connected to the fact that many of these writers were queer, or they were gender non-conforming, or we were Asian and neurodiverse, and there were multiple things we were noticing amongst writers who were not perhaps getting the chances, but also who were writing in a certain style. So we were in a more, I guess, experimental, innovative style. So it's like an even more niche category. And so we decided to set up a press. Initially, it was small events, small books, small run books. but what we did and what we always focused on was the community aspect of it. And it built itself in a way. There was straight away that we noticed there was an audience for it. There was an energy for it. This was in London. Um, and we realized we can take this further. So we didn't have a huge ambition at the start to become, a very established press, but we understood, okay, there is something here. And we slowly learned as we were doing it, okay, we need to get distribution. We need to work on certain scheduling, 6 months, a year in advance. We need to um, we need to work on marketing a little bit. All these things we sort of learned on the job. But also talking with people. We were always careful to go, okay, we don't live in a vacuum. There are other presses doing this. There are other people doing this. There's a history of this. It's not come out of nowhere. And we need to talk to them, see what they did wrong, maybe. That's quite useful as well. And we took it from there. So in terms of like as a writer, I felt like, okay, we need to provide a space where we can do this collaboratively. We're part of the same process. We want the publisher to be part of the process. We don't want it to be overly didactic. And that's, I think, one of the questions you put to us, Leo, was what's the difference between a small press and a big press? And that's one of the big differences, is that we're on your level. And if we say certain things about marketing, or if we say certain things about the tone, it's not because we don't agree with what you do. It's we've learned, okay, this will work a bit better to get into a bookstore. It's a bit more pragmatic, I guess. That's one of the things I think a small press can bring.
Mm-hmm. And so what you mentioned something about, you said, because you're so kind of unique in your niche. So what is it, some of the things that you look for?
I think one of the things we look for is when we come across writers, or if writers come to us, is we need to know context. We need to know, like, what are you reading? Who do you see as your forebearers, but also your peers? We want to know, okay, if you're working in, say, autofiction, we want to know that you know the field, and often that's very clear once you read like a chapter. Okay, they know some of the tropes, but they know themselves as well. That's one of the things we're trying to look for. If we come across, a romanticist poet, we're thinking, okay, what are you doing that's different? What's because we're not interested in copy paste 19th century poetry or something, but there is obviously stuff there which is of interest, and which is of interest today. So what are you doing with that sort of interest, and you can apply and is somehow relevant to what's going on now. You know.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I sometimes I hear editors or the readers who are going through all the manuscripts that come in. They talk about, I love this manuscript. And I always wonder, well, okay, so like you love this manuscript, but that's like one person, and what if you don't love the manuscript? So if David, maybe you could touch upon this topic in terms of like, well, how can you read a manuscript and not only view it from your own perspective, but kind of see also look outward towards the outside world and see what do we need as a community, as a larger community, of readers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think what Kashif said about context and community is really central to this. My degree is in poetry, and I'm a poet, and so I'm kind of in that small press world and the university press world. Even as a book editor, I'm very much kind of in the the legacy world of the great dinosaur publishers who are kind of still lumbering through the landscape. So there's often a kind of dissonance in how art is defined and how community and context are defined. And I'll speak just for a minute, I guess, maybe as an editor, as kind of a way into this. I'm a manuscript editor. I'm a developmental editor. I was formerly an editor at Crown Publishers, which was known for popular fiction and the joy of sex as much as a literary fiction. So I came from both those perspectives. And I guess what I could try to come down to as an editor is to see myself as a reader and to imagine myself as the most necessary reader for a particular book. I think a good editor is a lens, not a mirror, and ideally can sharpen what is already on the page. There are a few notorious stories of editors who have, basically rewritten entire manuscripts to make them sound like the editor. But I think that's the exception. The real connection, I think, for all of us is certainly how we can nurture authors, but how we can connect them with readers. So I try to be kind of a reader-centered editor, and as a teacher as well, to encourage people to imagine their best possible readers in ways that can sharpen the work. I try to focus a lot on the idea that writing is not only about self-expression, it's about communication. And when we frame things in terms of a reader who is smart, distracted maybe, who needs to be persuaded to spend, 10 pounds or $16 on a book and 8 hours of their time, that can be very clarifying as long as we're not pandering to them or giving them things they've already seen, but challenging them and trying to create a real kind of intimate connection. Books, unlike other art forms, are experienced in private. They're intimate, they're one-on-one. And to come into it with that kind of framing, I think, is a way to create greater connection and ultimately more book sales and more community.
Yeah. Lucia, what do you think about what's being discussed? I know that you've had experience publishing small presses, and also just in general trying to find ways to work through publishing in English and also in Spanish. If you could talk a little bit about who you are and what you've encountered.
Okay. Well, as you mentioned, I am a writer. I write mainly, or I have published mainly poetry. In both English and lately in Spanish as well. I have translated poetry and published it, like segments of poetry books. For example, from Nicole Silly's, from English to Spanish, and also some poets from Ecuador, from Spanish to English. And I have spent quite an amount of time lately in Ecuador. And then I became more familiar than I was before with the literary scene there, and definitely found that it was very different from what I found here, right? As a writer, that is my main experience within this ecosystem. I would say that I have found fairly good opportunities to publish in the US. And I did publish one book in the United Kingdom as well, all of them with independent publishers, small independent publishers. The first publication came after I won a small literary contest in Oregon, I think. So I think, as I said, thinking about what I have seen in Ecuador lately, there are many opportunities here to find a community in which your words find some resonance. And that is one reason for which, for example, even in the moments of despair, I didn't go the road of the self-publication, because I wanted to find out whether or not what I was writing would resonate. I didn't want to publish just because I wanted to be a published author, but somebody who really whose words in some way, at some level, to some readers, they find that those words engaging, and that say something that they would like to take home. As I was saying, then in Ecuador, I found very lively live events happening that has been lately hindered by some for the violence that linked to just regular violence and some link to narco traffic, right? So it was very saddening for me to read that one library that it was also a gathering place, an events place, literary events place, was temporarily closing its doors because they didn't feel safe to work. And then a lot of bookstores sell their books via messengers, because on top of that, currently there is no national postal service in Ecuador, which in turn increases the cost of the books, because these services, private services, are not that cheap. And then sometimes if you are the owner of a small independent library that has books that the main libraries don't carry because they are from more experimental writers, then they get into their car and go house by house in the neighboring, neighborhoods, distributing the books. So it is a very, very different environment, but perhaps due to that, there is some a great appreciation of what the written word brings to the table.
Yes, I'm gonna just pause for 1 second. So I really appreciated what you touched upon, Lucia, because you mentioned in terms of how you were trying to avoid the self-publishing aspect. And I wanted to know if maybe some of you could talk about what the differences, in your opinion, are about self-publishing, and also what is the reputation of self-publishing as opposed to publishing with big presses or small presses.
I'll jump in. I think with self-publishing, the question is what a publisher gives you, and even if it's a small publisher, even if it's just 1 or 2 people, it gives you some accountability or some oversight.
So just to follow what you said, Lucia, about how you kind of avoided the self-publishing road and went with different various presses, small presses, independent presses. I just wanted to know if any
just want to make it clear that it's not that I am against self-publishing. It can be a good option for somebody. I was not definitely at that place at that moment, because what I said, but for some other people, at some other time along their writing career, it may be a better option.
No, absolutely. I understand you, because I actually have, spoken to other writers, and, even I myself could have gone out already 100 times over and just said, oh, let me self-publish. So I do understand where you're coming from. And I would just like to know from the others who are in the industry, what are your thoughts about, about self-publishing versus small presses versus obviously the big houses, but also what are those, what are some of the reasons why people hesitate to self-publish, or they do self-publish, and how does that affect their future publishing? I've heard that it does impact their future publishing with presses when the presses find out that they've self-published. If you could just talk a little bit about that.
I'll come in because this is an issue that a lot of my authors are dealing with. I also, until recently, I really cast a cold eye on self-publishing for a lot of authors, and more I am finding that the gate is so narrow into at least legacy publishing for a lot of authors that many people are just not being appreciated because they don't have the platform, because they're not already in a received literary community. And with so few in the US, so few new novels coming out each year from new authors, debut novels, there's just a lot of great stuff that's not finding a readership, at least through the traditional path. And so I'm encouraging certain of my authors of memoir and also of some literary fiction and definitely genre fiction to really consider doing it on their own terms. You're especially successful, and this may be a little different than the purview of our panel, you're especially successful if you're publishing into a genre that already has a community. If you are writing fantasy, dystopian fiction, and other kinds of writing, there's a received community there that you can go for. That's less true, I think, for literary fiction, where, again, the seal of approval from an established house can make a real difference. I think it's also less true for poetry. There's certain poetry houses that are hybrid enough that they have not been considered by the powers that be as actually curating their work in a way that allows you to apply for an NEA grant here in the US. So I think those are real concerns. But I think for a lot of people, the smaller presses have not always stepped forward to create an environment for literary novels, especially. There's much more emphasis on short fiction. And definitely for memoir. There's so many wonderful memoirs, including the lyric memoir that we're also celebrating as the genres move, that just are not being published in enough quantity by smaller houses, at least in the US. And a lot of those books can indeed find a real audience as literary works, as well as ones that can find real readership. There are definitely drawbacks for it. Once you go with a self-publisher, that book is in that world forever, unless you sell in the US 10,000 copies of it, and then maybe you'll become the next 50 Shades of Gray, or at least 5 Shades of Gray. So you're kind of there, but it can indeed be a platform. And I think there's one unifying thing that authors have to step forward around, which is no matter whether you're being published by Random House or by a small established press or on your own, you have to be an entrepreneur. You have to be the one out there authoring your book, moving it forward. You have to be the author of your publishing experience in partnership with a publisher. And sometimes you could have more power with the smaller press where you're not going to wait 2 years. You may not get as much money up front, but in any case, you're going to have to be an entrepreneur. And I think that's one of the real challenges for creative writers of all kinds right now that we see most highlighted in the self-publishing world. Whitman self-published, and Whitman was the most annoying, author of his era, and stole a quote from Emerson and put it on the spine of his book. You don't do that to a blurb. But he's one of the reigning geniuses of our era who would not have been published by any big or small press in 1855. So there's some models out there, including among avant-garde and experimental writers of our own time.
Thank you. That's actually really very interesting what you're saying, and I want to add something to that. But Kashif, do you have anything to add to?
Yeah, I guess from my perspective and what I've done or we've done with the press is we've sort of said, if you need to think about the reasons why it might be difficult to get published. So one, that either means you need to work at what you're doing, or two, it means there isn't the space for you, and in which case, why don't you try and develop that space as part of a collective movement? you know. So you're not just, so what, you know, I would advocate, or we were advocating then, well, why don't we build the small press, you know, that would publish our own work. And that was what we initially set out to do. We were like, we want to publish our own work, but under an umbrella in which we could, you know, invite other people, you know, who are similar to us. And in that way, it can become something more collective. We don't want to write in a vacuum. We don't want to be in a vacuum, you know. That's, as you said, the worst thing about writing is that it is, you know, directly from author to reader. It's very difficult to necessarily see where it goes, you know. You can't, apart from the occasional, unless you're doing a book tour or something, right? But most of the actual engagement with the object you can't see, right? So, you know, that's what I would advocate for people to do to some degree, because I think it also develops a greater sustainability in the end at the end of it.
Absolutely.
To either build or kind of latch on to a literary community that you feel speaks to your voice. That's no, that, I mean, that is encouraging. But also, you know, in some ways, there's all these, like, you know, small pockets of communities, which I do think is great. And I think that it wasn't always like this, you know. And so going back to what David mentioned, actually, I think it's really interesting what you've said, because this publishing aspect of trying to fit into a space. How do you view, like, in terms of the big houses, what is the reputation that the small presses or self-publishing, what is the reputation they have in, you know, in the big houses, and how are they navigating because of all the things that are, and all the changes that are going on, do you think?
The big houses?
Yeah. In terms of now seeing how in general the publishing industry is shifting, like we've mentioned, you know, people are self-publishing, they're publishing with small presses. How is that impacting the big houses, and what is happening to their, like, are there any shifts going on in their spheres?
I'll just speak
Yeah.
for what I've perceived. I think there's been a belief among the major houses that the small ones are there to feed them authors that they can then make a lot of money off of. When I was starting some time back, I started an LGBTQ publishing group, networking group of authors and other publishing professionals, to try to bring more energy into mainstream publishing where I was. And one lesbian book publisher said to me, David, if you succeed at what you do, you will single-handedly destroy all the small press world that I've taken my whole life to build. That did not make me happy to hear. But there is this kind of sense, I think, that if the big presses notice at all the smaller houses, it's to see what writers they can bring in, and sometimes that can really benefit those writers, and other times it can be kind of a parasitical system. It fascinates me that at the AWP Writers Conference, almost no major publishers show up. There is, I think, a distinction still between MFA world, and which Chad Harback has written about, and NYC world among writers and in general. But it may well be that these larger publishers who are so agglomerated now just are going to be too sclerotic to really do the creative work to build new authors on their own. They're reaching out, especially for writers of color, for BIPOC writers, and who I think have intense stories. And one agent who's a woman of color said that she doesn't think it's going to last, that this is a real kind of fad among big publishers to do the right thing in our current era, and it won't be sustainable. They won't make enough money off these writers. So the small press world and the creation of that world is, I think, just so essential on its own as an autonomous, you know, cultural venue and value.
Anybody wants to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of build off that, I think, you know, the big press can come and they can take you know, cherry pick effectively a few things, but a few writers, but like you said, they haven't necessarily built those writers themselves. And without, you know, what a small press can do is it can give it can give context as well. You know, it can give a network. It can give someone a social base to be like, okay, this is where I can build from. It's not the only place. People, you know, there are many writers who develop their own communities and however they do it. But I think it's one place where it happens. And you know, like you said, how many of these writers that they're going to pick out are going to have long, successful careers? You know, are they going to just have a couple run and then that, you know, they get lost? You know, that can happen as well.
Absolutely.
You know, going back to the conversation about, you know, what are editors and readers in the publishing houses look for, I was actually wanted to talk a little bit about the editing process and how that, you know, going back to what the topic, the title of our panel is, in terms of compromising, you know, a writer and their vision for what they're doing. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the editing process for all of you, and what is that like, and how do you kind of establish a sense of ground between the editing process and also preserving the authenticity and the voice of the writer. And I would really like to start just to hear from Lucia as a writer. And I know we're all writers here, but I'm saying, you know, in terms of when you send out your work, if you could talk a little bit about that experience, and how do you know as a writer also, not only as from the editor's perspective, with Kashif and David, but also from your perspective as a writer, at which point do you kind of take on the advice or the suggestions they're given, and at what point you decide, but I still want to preserve this and perhaps go, you know, to another venue. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I am going to talk about two experiences that happened at the beginning of my writing career, which is not that far away in time because I started very late this career, right? So my first publication offer came from the UK, and it was a brand new publishing house. And it was my first publication offer. I was absolutely thrilled, excited about my manuscript being accepted. And then something happened and the funding didn't come through, and this publishing house folded. And that book was not published. And that was the best thing that could have happened to me, definitely, as a writer, because in retrospect, that material was not ready. And I think the editor probably, like, the thematic was very interesting, ecological and social conscious poems, etc. But I think that in retrospect, that material needed a good editing eye. And so I haven't published that yet. I'm still working on it. So that was the first experience. The second one was a long poem that I submitted to a magazine, Sharpak Annual, that in that issue, they were publishing long poems. And then the editor, it was at the very beginning of my writing career, as I said. The editor told me, this material is kind of almost ready, but needs some editorial eye. Do you agree on working with me with this material? And I had no ego attached to that, really. I was very grateful for that opportunity. And I said, yes, of course. And we work on that. And then I follow, like, what I gather was kind of the essence of the conversations. And I took that new knowledge to the rest of the poem. It was a longer poem. I had submitted a fragment. And that was the material that went on to win the literary prize that made it possible that this long poem was published. So in my case, I can see in these two examples that for a novice writer, the work of the editor can be absolutely important. And myself, later on, and of course, because English is not my first language, in my case, I guess it is perhaps even more important. I send my material to an editor with whom I work, and that gives me feedback about what she thinks about the new book, and then I work based on that. So yeah, definitely I give a lot of importance to the work of the editor.
Thank you. Yeah, those stories are interesting, and also I'm sure there's many stories. I had a poet who read at one of my events who said that, he also was innocently, he went with a small press, and even though it's a small press, but it's like a known press. And, there was a lot of things that he didn't know as a newcomer. And so he felt a little bit cheated in a way, just by not only the financial aspects of what he needed to invest, and also what he ended up getting, not getting from the editor and the publisher, and I mean the whole press. But yeah, it was a learning experience, and that's why I think it's important to just talk a little bit about some of these topics and issues that people could face, and also not really know what to expect. So, David, I know you and I have talked separately in our private conversations about some of the ways in which we can, kind of hone in on our own independence of what we think, independence with our own writing, and then at the same time also give space for editing. If either one of you, Kashif or David, want to talk a little bit about your experiences as writers and editors.
Chief, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I guess for as a writer and an editor, one of the things which we've done, how can I put it? I'm always open to talking.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always open to talking with peers, conversations, whether that's, at events or if that's taken to the emails. And, there's an informality there, which is important. And sometimes, that might end up with somebody having a manuscript and, they're looking for advice, and you might give them some advice. And it might not necessarily, it's not necessarily in a formal capacity as an editor, but they know that you have some experience. And it may be that I go, oh, I know there's certain presses that are open to this, So one of the ways I try and see, my work as an editor, but between, I guess, the sort of informality of certain, particularly poetry scenes. Actually, this is a particular aspect of poetry, I think, and part of the 87, which is now, we're publicly funded and we're much more formalized now. Is being able to say, this isn't right for us, but here's how we can do it. Here's where you can go with it, or here's where you should go with it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you should approach this agent. Maybe that's a better route for you than us. There's ways of thinking about it, and we've got to a stage where saying no to certain manuscripts, but on a very constructive level, I think is very important. In terms of saying, well, I'm not entirely sure you know what you're doing. That's a key point. And a lot of the discussions I have with poets in particular, it happens with novelists as well. is going, okay, this is well written, it has a lot of promise, but how do you feel about it? Are you there with it? Do you feel comfortable? Is it going to lead you to further, success? Because you don't want to end up with something like you said, Lucia, where you're not happy with it, and then it kind of stymies your future in a way, because you feel like, well, this is me then. I can't. You want your first step to be a good step. So particularly we work particularly with debut writers as well. So that's sort of one element that I think bridges the writer-editor gap as well, in terms of knowing what writers want or what they need.
That's really good to know, actually, and comforting. I'm going to send writers to you now. Get ready, because there's a lot of writers that need to be nurtured, so that they can actually, because I feel like in a way, sometimes when there's disappointment, which is totally okay and so expected, there's ways to receive that disappointment. And so a lot of times I hear stories where, people feel like they were dragged along and then rejected, or, told to revise things and then things didn't work out anyway. So I think nurturing and sending them off in like a positive note, and preserving their sense of belief and promise in their work is something that's nice. But also, obviously, it's not always the case. But yeah, David, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I think the author's the boss, and yet, of course, the publisher is the boss of the publishing house, and how those people converge, and why your book, of all the books that are going to walk into this cafe, why should they pick yours? And I think there are questions that authors can deal with as well. There are 5 questions that I tell my authors, whether they're poets or thriller writers, or literary fiction people, or memoirists, that 5 questions that everyone's going to ask about your book. And the first one to ask will be an agent or an editor. They all begin with W, so it's easy to remember them. The first, and I'll run through them really quickly, is what's it about? And so many authors are really unable to tell you what their book is about in a really quick, crisp way that a publisher and a reader are going to need as well. I will not take the time to give examples of that, but I think editors can help crystallize that for authors as they figure out the larger notion of what their book is really, what its subject is, what its themes are. And a lot of authors aren't quite able to articulate that, and yet everyone will have to do that along the way. These questions are going to be asked by the reader in a bookstore as well. Why here, at Foyles and, on Charing Cross Road, should I pick your book as opposed to another? The second is who's it by, which we've talked about. Who are you as an author? Where are you in the community? What do you represent and identify with? One line I have, and others of you may disagree, but that I think publishers in some ways don't want to publish books. They want to publish authors. And readers want to read books. They want to read authors, and we even frame things that way instead of books. We'll talk about, reading the new Kaveh Akbar here, the poet. We'll frame things that way. So the more you are a presence, a place, and a participant in a community to the best of your skills and sensibility, the better. The third is what's it like? What other books does your book relate to? What else have you read? What other books would be on the same shelf or would share a reader with you? And for me, it's a red flag when authors cannot articulate other books that they're in context of. And I think Lucia's pointed to this, and definitely Kashif, you have as well, that sense of the community of reading as well as of readers and writers. The fourth is who's it for? Which is a bit demographic and a little tricky, but again, people tend to read and relate that way. And the last is why should we care? That while all the books in the world, for a press that's going to pick maybe 20 out of 500 that they'll interact with, why your book? Which I think speaks to taking greater risks and being more out there and more adventurous to see how your book is different from other books, how it really creates something new in the world and that isn't derivative, and to encourage that in the writing. So if you can navigate those 5 W's, if an editor can help with that and an author can do it, then I think there's even more ultimate connection with that reader in a way that would indeed be, sustainable for that author and for the people who'd publish and propagate that author's work.
It's very helpful what you've just mapped out here. I really think that is quite beneficial for a lot of writers who are starting out. I think my last question for the panel would be just to talk a little bit about where you think the future of our readership and our book publishing is going. In also, if you want to touch on the subject of, and I know it's like a whole other panel that I should have had as well, in terms of our textbooks and the information that is totally excluded from the future generations, from our children, but that kind of goes into the whole AI and GPT generated works, and how does that interfere or support, or is it an evolution, yet another kind of evolution in the industry? I mean, what are your thoughts? I know some of us are also teachers, so how does that impact just overall your thoughts and ideas about what this is going to do and how it's going to shape the industry? Who wants to go first? Lucy, you want to start?
Okay. I think that after the pandemic, the confinement, a lot of these technologies came to the front, and since then are more part of our lives than before in a more consistent way. This is the way in which we communicate now, right? And it opened a lot of doors, I think. I had opportunities to listen to and to converse with writers from other parts of the world with whom I wouldn't have had any way of contacting if were not because of these Zoom events, etc. It opened the door to many Zoom workshops, conversations, panels in France, in South America, etc. So that, for me, it is tremendously beneficial for this ecosystem to open it to other voices. I am not that familiar with AI still. I should be. But one of my first conclusions about this is like, I don't think that we can avoid this, but maybe we can regulate it a little bit more. Like, for example, the minimum would be to indicate to the consumer that this product has been made with material harvested. Like the like that on the arrest. Okay. And when I hear from artists that publish their visual works, for example, on social, is that this material is being harvested by these artificial intelligence, and how is this intellectual property going to be recognized? Or also mining the written world. So these are new dilemmas, and I think we are not ready to respond to that. But this discussion has to be had. We have to have this discussion.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think just to jump in, I think I agree. Yeah, I don't have very strong views on this because I don't, I feel like it's very early days in terms of what this can do. I think my initial reaction is maybe there's some useful tool, maybe it provides a useful tool, AI, but it will, for I think a long time, just be a gimmick. That's my opinion. Certainly with we've had certain things before in terms of computer generated art, in terms of people try and do things with poetry and they work out algorithms and so on. We've had some versions of this, and it's never really kicked off in terms of anything that important or interesting. That's my initial reaction. The question will be, yeah, if an AI can produce, a decent novel, one that ticks all the genre, boxes and somehow passes itself off as a real, bona fide, real living author, then that opens up a certain kind of worms, in which readers and people in general are going to have to be more discerning, So we see this obviously with news already, in terms of, I think a lot of people are thinking, well, maybe I'm only going to listen to certain platforms now. I certainly think like that, in terms of, well, I know that it's gone through an editorial process, and I wonder if that's going to be the move. I know the Guardian has a certain standards, which I don't know what happens on Twitter. Maybe it sounds like conservative on one level because we're then moving back to the bigger platforms, if that makes sense, or the legacy platforms. I don't know. It's early days for sure.
Well, fortunately, AI at this point can write only really terrible poetry, so we can hope that can continue. But I think as Kashif says, it's a very much in the middle of things and new. And as Lucia says too, it's hugely fraught around intellectual property. Just yesterday, there was a class action suit filed in San Francisco against ChatGPT, claiming basically that all the stuff they're using is plagiarized from all of the work that's out there through various book resources. So this is a massive act of plagiarism and of stealing intellectual property that I hope will at least be part of this as we continue. It's created work that's creating this artificially created work, and that's a bummer, at the very least. But beyond that, I'm really excited about something that I'm seeing more and more, and I don't think we know how to deal with, which is that the genres of writing seem to me to be breaking down. What we would have called even 5 years ago, lyric poetry, is now interacting with the memoir, and the lyric memoir itself is a new genre, the lyric essay. I think things even beyond the written word disciplines are moving forward, and that bring in video or film or other visual arts and music. So all of the categories that define our bookstores and a lot of our publishing are changing. And to me, that's the really adventurous place, particularly for people who perceive themselves as experimental and avant-garde writers. Our old categories are changing as our technology is and as our view of things is. And I think that's exciting. I don't think we know how to deal with it yet, and I can't wait.
I agree, David. I'm with you, because I feel like in some ways, the people who felt trapped within the confines of the structures that have been placed for hundreds of years, and the genres that we only knew, these little few pockets of where we could feel like we fit, seem to be a little bit more spacious now, and we have the opportunity to explore and also kind of learn from each other, which is what oftentimes I really love to do with Wordshed, where you have a community of artists who come together, who love poetry but are not poetry writers, and they're musicians, but then they can expand in their form just by being inspired by the people who surround them, and then find new ways to even experience their own creativity. So no, I really appreciate all of you for your wonderful insight and thoughts. And I thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to maybe connecting with you for another great conversation. So thank you very much for all your insight and inspiration. And
Thank you.
let's see
Thanks for the invitation.
more.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.